Hello and welcome to Wrestler Spotlight. I'm the Maritime Warrior, and this episode we are talking about the confusing history of the Midnight Express. Now, what I mean with the confusing history is that there's been multiple Midnight Express in the history of wrestling. Some versions of the Midnight Express even happen at the same times as other versions of the Midnight Express, so we're all going to cover that in this video. So let's get started with the first Midnight Express. Now, I must mention there was a film in the 70s called The Midnight Express. Now, the plot of this movie is a young American is caught by Turkish police while attempting to smuggle hash out of Istanbul and is sent to prison for 4 years. And I believe the only way that he can escape back to America is by catching the Midnight Express. Great film, highly recommend it, but we're talking about wrestling's Midnight Express. And the first Midnight Express would be formed in 1980 in Southeastern Championship Wrestling. Now, the seeds planted to start the Midnight Express start with two wrestlers forming a tag team. This was Randy Rose and Dennis Condrey. They would feud with Norvell Austin and his tag team partners. Eventually, he would start teaming with Brad Armstrong, and they would trade the Southeastern tag team titles until Norvell Austin would turn on Brad Armstrong and join Randy Rose and Dennis Condrey. These three men would be the first ever incarnation of the Midnight Express. This trio of the Midnight Express would mostly work in Southeastern Championship Wrestling and Continental Wrestling Association, CWA. This is also known as the Memphis Territory. The trio would win the Southeastern Tag Team titles 7 times, the Southern Tag Team titles in CWA 2 times, and the CWA World Tag Team titles once. The trio would split up in 1983. Dennis Condrey would start wrestling for Mid-South Wrestling, and that's where the next version of the Midnight Express would be formed. As far as Norvell Austin goes, he would remain in the Southern Territories like Southeastern and the Memphis Territory until he would retire from professional wrestling in 1986. Randy Rhodes would travel to different territories after the split, but it is not the last that we hear from Randy Rhodes in this video. Dennis Condrey would adapt the name Loverboy Dennis Condrey, and he would start teaming up with beautiful Bobby Eaton, and they would have their manager Jim Cornette with them. This would be in Bill Watts' Mid-South territory. They would have a handful of feuds in Mid-South, including one feuding with Bill Watts himself, but the two big feuds, the first one was feuding with Magnum TA and Mr. Wrestling 2. The two teams would feud over the Mid-South Tag Team titles during this time period. The Midnight Express would even tar and feather Magnum TA during their feud. This rivalry would end after Mr. Wrestling 2 would turn on Magnum TA, and they would start feuding. This would leave the door open for the Midnight Express to start feuding with a team that they would be connected to for many years to come, the Rock and Roll Express, Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson. These two teams would trade the Mid-South Tag Team titles back and forth until the Midnight Express would leave for WCCW, World Class Championship Wrestling. Their time in WCCW was relatively short. They would feud with Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers, the Fantastics, and they would win the NWA American Tag Team titles before they would make their way to Jim Crockett Promotions in 1985. In JCP, the Midnight Express would reignite their feud with the Rock and Roll Express. The Midnight Express would even win the NWA World Tag Team titles by defeating the Rock and Roll Express. In February of 1986, they would hold the NWA World Tag Team titles for 195 days. A lot of people say that this NWA World Tag Team title reign is the peak of the Midnight Express. They were the top tag team in the NWA and had a very good title reign to back that claim. The Midnight Express would drop the NWA World Tag Team titles back to the Rock and Roll Express on August 16, 1986. During this time period, Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express would have a bodyguard, Big Bubba Rogers. Big Bubba Rogers would later on be known as the Big Boss Man in the WWF. This version of the Midnight Express would also feud with the New Breed. This was Chris Champion and Sean Royal. But quite possibly what this version of the Midnight Express is most remembered for is their rivalry with Hawk and Animal, the Road Warriors, and their scaffold match that took place at Starrcade 86, Night of the Skywalkers. The Road Warriors would get the win by throwing Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton off the scaffold, but it would not be over there. They would chase Jim Cornette up the scaffold, and Jim Cornette would fall off the scaffold, severely injuring his knee. In March of 1987, Dennis Condrey would leave Jim Crockett Promotions. He would be replaced in advertised matches by Big Bubba Rogers. Not long after that, the third version of the Midnight Express would be formed, as Beautiful Bobby Eaton would be joined by Sweet Stan Lane. This version of the Midnight Express would be remembered mostly for being the NWA United States Tag Team Champions on multiple occasions. In 1988, while they were the NWA United States Tag Team Champions, they would defeat Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson to win the NWA World Tag Team titles, making them double champions. When Dennis Condrey left JCP, he would reform the original Midnight Express with Randy Rose in the AWA, with their manager, a very young Paul Heyman, going by the name of Paul E. Dangerously. While in the AWA, the original Midnight Express would win the AWA World Tag Team titles. They would win these titles from Jerry the King Lawler and Superstar Bill Dundee before losing the titles to the Midnight Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. They were AWA World Tag Team Champions for 58 days. On an episode of World Championship Wrestling, Jim Cornette would receive an on-air phone call from someone who claimed to be anonymous. Jim Cornette would recognize the voice and challenge this person to come out and face him. That's when Paul E. Dangerously came out with the original Midnight Express, and they laid out this new Midnight Express of Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane. This would start what should have been the biggest tag team rivalry in the world, Midnight Express versus Midnight Express. There was a very strong start to this rivalry, but it would cool off before it ended. Before the final Midnight Express versus Midnight Express match would happen, Dennis Condrey would once again leave the promotion, and he would be replaced by Jack Victory, as Jim Cornette's Midnight Express would be victorious. This final match took place at the Chi-Town Rumble pay-per-view in 1989. For the rest of 1989 and 1990, Stan Lane and Bobby Eaton would feud with such teams as the Rock and Roll Express, the Dynamic Dudes, this was Shane Douglas and Johnny Ace, Flyin' Brian Pillman and the Z-Man, and the Steiner Brothers, Rick and Scott Steiner. In late 1990, both Stan Lane and Jim Cornette would leave the promotion, but Bobby Eaton would remain with WCW for many years to come. He would win the NWA World Tag Team titles once again with multiple partners. He would even win the NWA World Television title, and he would be part of Paul Heyman's Dangerous Alliance. In 1991, Jim Cornette would start his own wrestling promotion, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and Sweet Stan Lane would join him in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Smoky Mountain Wrestling would close its doors in 1995. Jim Cornette would also start working for the WWF in 1993, even managing WWF World Heavyweight Champion Yokozuna. He would also form Camp Cornette with Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, and Owen Hart, as they would also win the WWF World Tag Team titles, and Yokozuna and Owen Hart would also win the WWF World Tag Team titles. The other big member of Camp Cornette was Big Van Vader. He also managed Mantar. Can't win them all. In 1998, Jim Cornette would start the NWA invasion of the WWF. He would manage NWA World Heavyweight Champion and former UFC Champion Dan the Beast Severn during this time period. But where this ties into the Midnight Express is there would be a team called the New Midnight Express. This was Bob Holly and Bart Gunn, going by the names of Bombastic Bob and Bodacious Bart. This team of the New Midnight Express would also win the NWA World Tag Team titles. The new Midnight Express is universally hated by most everybody because it's not the Midnight Express, it's just a cheap copy. No disrespect to Bob Holly and Bart Gunn, they did great things in their career, but the new Midnight Express is not one of them. This tag team and the NWA Invasion angle did not last very long in the WWF. In the mid-2000s, there would be multiple Midnight Express reunions. This would involve Jim Cornette, Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, and Stan Lane. This would last until 2011. In 2004, Big Bubba Rogers, aka Big Boss Man, would pass away at the age of 41. In 2021, beautiful Bobby Eaton would pass away at the age of 62. As of this recording in 2024, Jim Cornette has his own podcast, and the rest of the Midnight Express members are either semi-retired or fully retired. The Midnight Express easily should be in everybody's top 5 favorite tag teams of all time. Not counting the new Midnight Express, that is. A lot of people will tell you that they are the best tag team in wrestling history, and these people might just be right. And with that, that'll be the end of this episode. I want to thank you all for listening to the Maritime Warrior, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.